The gravel crunched under my rented loafers like crushed glass. I was sweating through a stiff polyblend suit, clutching a crumpled save-the-date card that had been sitting on my truck's dashboard for 8 months. I smelled like stale coffee, Old Spice, and desperation. Today, I was going to give my daughter away. I didn't park at the venue. The invitation, or rather the thick cream-colored cardstock bearing only the date and the city that I'd received back in October, indicated the event was at the Hawthorne Botanical Gardens. I knew the place. It was the kind of gated, manicured estate on the edge of town where the trees were imported, the grass was cut with scissors, and the air always smelled faintly of money and fertilizer. I left my beat-up F 153 blocks down the road, tucked behind a strip mall dumpster. I didn't want the kid at the valet stand looking at my cracked windshield, and more importantly, I didn't want my daughter's new, high tax bracket in-laws seeing the rust on my bumper. The walkover was a mistake. By the time I reached the wrought iron gates, the July humidity had seeped into my bones. My shirt was plastered to my lower back, the collar of my jacket dug into the back of my neck like a dull knife. A young guy with a clipboard and a wireless earpiece stood at the entrance. He looked like he was 12, dressed in a navy suit that cost more than my first car. "Name, sir?" he asked. His eyes flicked to my shoes. The loafers were scuffed at the toe. I hadn't had the time or the cash to get them shined. "Thomas Miller," I said. My voice sounded too loud, too rough for the delicate surroundings. "I'm the father of the bride." The kid's perfectly groomed eyebrows pulled together. He dragged a manicured finger down the list on his clipboard. Down, down, down. He flipped a page. "Miller, Miller. I have an Evelyn Miller Hayes and a Richard Hayes, but no Thomas." "I'm her dad," I repeated, the words tasting metallic in my mouth. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the save the date. It was soft at the edges from how many times I'd traced the gold foil lettering with my greasy thumbs. I shoved it toward his chest. "Look, Hannah Miller. That's my kid. She sent me this." He looked at the card, then back at me. A flash of pity crossed his face, which pissed me off more than outright hostility would have. "Sir, that's just the preliminary notice. The actual seating arrangements. Well, Mr. Hayes is listed as walking her down the aisle. Richard, Evelyn's husband, a guy who sold commercial insurance and wore cashmere sweaters tied around his neck. A guy who had paid for Hannah's college while I was drowning in a bottle of Jim Beam and fighting off foreclosure. I'm going in," I said. It wasn't a threat, just a flat statement of fact. I stepped past him. He made a half-hearted motion to stop me, murmuring something into his wrist mic, but I was already moving up the cobblestone path. The venue was agonizingly beautiful. String lights were woven through the canopy of ancient oak trees, glowing softly against the fading afternoon light. A string quartet was set up near a fountain, playing some unrecognizable, sweeping melody that made my teeth ache. Waiters in black vests floated through the gathering crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and appetizers that looked too small to actually eat. I stood at the edge of the reception area, a dark, sweaty stain on a pristine pastel painting. I scanned the crowd. I recognized faces from the past: Evelyn's sister, my old neighbors from when we lived in the suburbs, a few of Hannah's friends from high school who had grown up into polished, unrecognizable adults. Nobody noticed me, or if they did, they had the good grace to pretend I was invisible. I felt a sudden, suffocating urge to turn around, to walk back to the truck, crack a beer, and pretend this day never happened. That's what I did best, wasn't it? Disappear, when things got heavy. But then I saw her, Hannah. She was standing near the altar, bathed in the golden hour sunlight. She wore a dress that looked like it was made of spun sugar and sea foam. Her hair, which used to be a tangled rat's nest of curls that I'd spend hours trying to comb out on Sunday mornings, was pinned up in an elegant, intricate twist. She was laughing at something the groom David, a junior partner at a law firm, was saying. My breath hitched. The The tightness in my chest had nothing to do with the cheap suit or the heat. It was the sudden, violent realization that my little girl was gone, and a woman had taken her place. A woman I didn't know. I took a step forward. My shoe crunched loudly on a piece of gravel that had spilled onto the stone patio. Hannah turned. For a second, the universe held its breath. The string quartet seemed to mute. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. She looked across the 30 yards of manicured lawn, past the rows of white wooden chairs, past the rich in-laws and the waiters, and her eyes locked onto mine. I tried to smile. I raised my hand in a stiff, awkward wave. Her laughter died. The smile melted off her face, replaced by a sudden, chalky pallor. She whispered something to David, touched his arm, and began to walk toward me. She didn't run. She didn't march. She walked with a terrifying, deliberate calmness. With every step she took, the smell of the floral arrangements, thousands of white lilies and orchids seemed to grow thicker, cloying, like funeral flowers. I met her halfway, standing on the edge of the perfectly cut grass. Up close, the details of her face broke my heart all over again. She had Evelyn's nose, but she had my eyes. Dark, heavy-lidded, prone to dark circles when she didn't sleep. Today, though, they were clear. And cold. "Hi, kiddo," I rasped. My throat felt like it was coated in sawdust. Hannah stopped exactly 3 feet away from me, out of arm's reach. The scent of her perfume washed over me, lavender and something sharp, like citrus. It was a sophisticated smell. When she was a kid, she used to smell like strawberry shampoo and dirt. "Thomas," she said. Not Dad. Not even a frustrated father. Thomas. The name hit my chest like a mallet. "You look." I swallowed hard, gesturing vaguely at her dress. "You look beautiful, Hannah. An angel. What are you doing here?" Her voice was low, modulated. She was hyper-aware of the eyes on us. I could see Evelyn standing near the front row, her hands covering her mouth, Richard resting a protective hand on her shoulder. "I came for the wedding," I said, trying to force a chuckle. It sounded like a death rattle. I patted my pocket. I got the card. The save the date. Hannah closed her eyes for a brief second. When she opened them, the coldness had cracked, revealing a deep, exhausted reservoir of pain. That was an automated mailing list. Thomas. It went out to everyone in my contacts before I scrubbed it. "You know you didn't get an actual invitation." I thought maybe it got lost in the mail. I lied. We both knew I was lying. "You haven't lived at the address on that envelope in 3 years, she replied, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "And you haven't called me in 2. I know I've been absent." I shifted my weight. The rented loafers pinched my toes. "But it's your wedding day, hon. A girl's dad is supposed to be at her wedding. I wanted to see you. I wanted to see you get married." "A girl's dad is supposed to be at a lot of things," she said. The words weren't yelled. They were delivered with surgical precision. "A girl's dad is supposed to be at her high school graduation. He's supposed to be there when she moves into her first dorm. He's supposed to be there when she gets in her first car accident." I was working. "You were drunk," she corrected, flatly. "Or you were sleeping it off. Or you were too busy feeling sorry for yourself because Mom left." The truth stung, venomous and sharp. I looked down at the grass. "I'm sober now. 11 months. I'm glad. Genuinely, I am." She didn't sound glad. She sounded tired. But 11 months of sobriety doesn't erase 20 years of flaking out. It doesn't earn you a front row seat to the best day of my life. I looked back up at her. The urge to defend myself, to yell, to make a scene flared up in my gut. That was the old Thomas, the guy who broke a kitchen chair against the wall because he felt disrespected. But looking at her in that white dress, all I felt was a crushing, hollow gravity. "Hannah, please, just let me sit in the back. I won't cause a scene. I won't even go to the reception. Just let me watch the ceremony. Let me see my daughter get married." She shook her head. A single slow movement. No. No. I said no. Her voice cracked. Just a fraction. A tiny fissure in the ice. Do you know how much anxiety I've had the past 3 weeks? Wondering if you were going to pull a stunt like this? Wondering if I'd look out from the altar and see you standing there, making this whole day about you and your guilt. I'm not making it about me. You showing up uninvited in a cheap suit, cornering me before I walk down the aisle, is making it about you, she said, her voice trembling now. Richard is walking me down the aisle. Richard was the one who held my hand when I was crying over boys. Richard was the one who taught me how to drive. You are just a man who gave me half my DNA and a lot of abandonment issues. I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my mouth, but there was nothing left to say. There was no argument I could win here. The jury had delivered the verdict years ago. I had just refused to show up for the sentencing. I need you to leave, Hannah said. She took a half step back, creating even more distance between us. Please, Dad, if you love me at all, if you have a single ounce of respect left for me, turn around and walk out of here. Don't make David call security. She called me Dad. It was the fatal blow. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was a plea. The little girl inside the grown woman begging the monster under the bed to just go away so she could sleep. I looked over her shoulder. David was watching us, his jaw set, ready to step in. Evelyn was crying. The string quartet had transitioned into something mournful. Okay, I whispered. My throat was so tight I could barely push the word out. Okay, Hannah, I'm going. I didn't try to hug her. I didn't tell her I loved her, because right then, my love felt like a toxic, heavy burden, and I wasn't going to drop it on her white dress. I turned around. The walk back down the cobblestone path was 1,000 miles long. The gravel crunched under my shoes again, but this time, it sounded like bones breaking. The kid at the entrance with the earpiece didn't say a word as I passed him. He just looked at the ground. I didn't remember the walk back to the truck. I only came back to my senses when I slammed the heavy metal door of the F-150 shut, sealing myself inside the suffocating oven of the cab. The heat was immediate and oppressive, but I didn't roll down the windows. I sat there in the sweltering silence, staring through the cracked, bug-splattered windshield at the brick wall of the strip mall. The smell of the truck hit me, a potent cocktail of stale tobacco, spilled motor oil, and the faint, sour tang of old sweat. It was the smell of my life. The smell of a man who worked with his hands, but had nothing to show for it. I grabbed the steering wheel, gripping the cracked leather cover until my knuckles turned stark white. I didn't cry. Crying would imply a release, a purging of emotion. What I felt wasn't sadness. It was a suffocating, dense shame. It sat on my chest like an anvil. You are just a man who gave me half my DNA. Her words bounced around the hot cabin, echoing off the glass. I leaned my head forward until my forehead rested against the top of the steering wheel. The plastic was scorching hot from the July sun, but I pressed my skin into it, welcoming the minor physical pain to distract from the gaping chest wound. I reached out blindly and popped the glove compartment. The latch stuck, it always did, so I hit it with the heel of my hand. It fell open with a plastic clatter, spilling a cascade of ancient napkins, faded registration papers, and a handful of fuse boxes onto the passenger seat. And something else. A small, yellow plastic object rolled across the worn fabric of the seat. I reached over and picked it up. It was a plastic triceratops. The horns were chewed up, and it was missing a leg. Instantly, the smell of the truck vanished, replaced by the phantom scent of rain on hot asphalt and the sound of a 7-year-old's high-pitched giggles. Flashback. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 14 years ago. I had picked Hannah up from school. It was raining, one of those sudden violent summer downpours. I was already 3 beers deep, having cracked my first one at lunch after losing a contracting bid. Hannah had climbed into the truck, dripping wet, holding this little plastic dinosaur. "Look what I traded for at recess, Daddy," she had chirped, entirely unbothered by the dampness seeping into the seats. "His name is Barnaby." "That's great, kid," I had muttered, turning the key. The wipers shrieked across the glass. I was irritable. My head throbbed. I didn't want to play along. Can we go get ice cream? You promised on Friday we'd get ice cream. Not today, Hannah. I'm tired. But you promised. I said not today. I had snapped, my voice booming in the confined space. She had flinched. I still remember the exact way her shoulders pulled up to her ears, the way the light died in her eyes. She had quietly placed the dinosaur in the open glove box and stared out the window for the rest of the ride home. I never apologized. I just went to the garage and drank until I couldn't remember why I was mad. I sat up in the stifling heat of the present, turning the broken toy over in my rough, calloused hands. She was right. Every word she said in that garden was a bullet of pure, unadulterated truth. I had convinced myself over the past 11 months of sobriety that simply stopping the drinking was enough, that the act of not putting alcohol into my body functioned as a magic eraser for the past. I thought I could put on a suit, show up with a smile, and claim the reward of fatherhood without having done any of the grueling, unglamorous work required to earn it. I looked at the crumpled save-the-date card resting on the passenger seat where it had fallen. The gold foil glinted mockingly in the sunlight. I hadn't come here today for Hannah. If I was honest with myself, truly, brutally honest in the sweltering heat of this rusted-out truck, I came here for me. I came to look at Evelyn and Richard and prove that I wasn't a total failure. I came to stand in the back and absorb the reflected glow of my daughter's success, so I could tell the guys down at the AA meeting that my kid was a beautiful bride. I wanted the snapshot. I wanted the movie moment. I didn't want the responsibility of being the father who showed up when it was hard. I dropped the dinosaur back into the glove compartment and slammed it shut. My hand moved to the ignition. The keys dangled there. I turned it. The engine coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, the exhaust rattling against the undercarriage. I cranked the AC, but it only blew hot, dusty air into my face. I put the truck in reverse and backed out of the space. As I pulled out onto the main road, heading in the opposite direction of the Ridgewood estate, the first tear finally broke free. It tracked through the sweat and dust on my cheek, hot and stinging. I was not invited. And for the first time in my life, I accepted that it was exactly what I deserved. The drive away from the Hawthorne Botanical Gardens was a blur of sun-bleached asphalt and the rhythmic, mocking thump of my truck's unbalanced front tire. I didn't have a destination. I just needed distance. Every mile I put between my rusted bumper and that pristine lawn felt like a necessary retreat, a quarantine procedure for a walking contagion. 20 minutes later, the manicured estates gave way to the brutalist concrete of the interstate loop. Gas stations, strip malls, and the towering, glowing signs of fast food joints replaced the ancient oaks. My throat was parched. A deep, familiar tremor started in my hands, radiating up my forearms. It wasn't just the adrenaline crashing. It was the cellular memory of how I used to handle pain. For 20 years, whenever the world got too sharp, I swallowed something that made it dull. I saw the neon sign of a discount liquor store humming against the twilight, Sammy's Spirits. The red letters flickered, casting a bruised, bloody light across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. I flicked my blinker on. I pulled the F-150 into a spot facing the glass storefront. I put the truck in park. I left the engine running. Through the dirty glass of the store, I could see the aisles, row upon row of amber, clear, and dark green bottles, standing like little glass soldiers waiting to offer me a temporary truce. My mouth watered, an actual, physical pooling of saliva under my tongue. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rapid, heavy thudding that drowned out the rattle of the exhaust pipe. Just a pint, a voice whispered in the back of my skull. It sounded exactly like me, just smoother, more reasonable. Just a pint of cheap bourbon. You can drink it in the cab, sleep it off in a motel, and wake up tomorrow and start over. 11 months is a good run. But today warrants a pass. Your own daughter kicked you out. No one expects you to stay dry through that. My hand hovered over the door handle. The plastic was hot and textured under my fingertips. I closed my eyes. I could already taste it, the sharp, fiery bite of the alcohol burning its way down my esophagus, a harsh scrub brush wiping away the humiliation, the memory of her cold eyes, The crushing realization of my own failure. It would be so easy. A $10 transaction, and the noise in my head would stop. I sat there for 5 minutes. 10. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging the cab into a suffocating dusk. Then I looked at the glove compartment. The latch was still slightly ajar from when I had slammed it. Inside sat the chewed-up plastic Triceratops. If I walked into that store, I was proving her right. I would be confirming every terrible thing she believed about me. The Thomas who drank was a coward who hid from his own mess. I swallowed hard, the dry click in my throat, loud, in the quiet cab. I grabbed the gear shift, yanked it out of park, and backed out of the lot. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the steering wheel straight. 2 miles down the road, I pulled into a 24-hour diner. It looked like a bruised aluminum can sitting on the side of the highway. The bell above the door jingled a flat, tuneless note as I walked in. The air conditioning was freezing, hitting my sweat-soaked suit like a wall of ice. The place smelled of burnt grease, old coffee, and industrial floor cleaner. It was the best thing I'd ever smelled in my life, simply because it didn't smell like Sammy Spirits. I slid into a corner booth. The red vinyl seat was patched with gray duct tape that caught and pulled at the fabric of my trousers. The Formica table was sticky. A waitress approached. She looked to be in her 60s, wearing a pink uniform dress and a name tag that read Doris. She had deep lines around her mouth and eyes that had seen every kind of late-night loser this highway had to offer. She didn't look at my cheap, rumpled suit or the sweat drying on my forehead. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice a raspy smoker's drawl. "Black, please." She flipped a thick, white ceramic mug right side up and filled it from a glass pot. The coffee looked like crude oil. "You want a menu, hun?" "No, just this. Thanks." I wrapped both hands around the mug. The ceramic was blisteringly hot, burning my palms. I welcomed the pain. It anchored me to the present. It kept me in the room. I took a sip. It was bitter, acidic, and had definitely been sitting on the burner for 3 hours. I drank it in deep, scalding gulps. A few booze down, a family of 3 was finishing their dinner. A father, a mother, and a little boy who looked to be about 6. The boy was whining, tired and overstimulated, smacking his sticky hands against the table. "Hey," the father said. His voice was firm but gentle. He reached across the table with a wet napkin, catching the boy's wrist. "Look at me, pal. We're done. Let's get cleaned up so we can go home and build that Lego set, okay?" The kid stopped crying. He sniffled, nodding, and let his dad wipe the ketchup off his chin. The father smiled, a tired, genuine smile, and ruffled the kid's hair. I looked away, staring down into the black abyss of my coffee mug. It was such a microscopic, unremarkable moment. A million fathers did it 1,000,000 times a day. But to me it looked like a magic trick. It was the daily, grinding, mundane work of being present. It was the exact work I had refused to do. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the save-the-date card. It was battered now, the edges fraying, a dark thumbprint smudged across the elegant script of Hannah's name. I laid it flat on the sticky Formica. I had treated this card like a ticket to redemption. I had built a fantasy around it. I thought my sobriety was a currency I could exchange for forgiveness. I thought if I stayed clean long enough, the universe would hand me back the family I broke. But forgiveness isn't a transaction. And sometimes you do the work, you get sober, you fight the demons, and you still don't get the girl back. You don't get the triumphant walk down the aisle. You get told to leave, and you have to live with that. I placed my thumbs on the top edge of the thick cardstock. I pulled my hands apart. The paper resisted for a second, then tore with a sharp, satisfying rip. I tore it in half. Then I stacked the halves and tore them again. I kept tearing until my daughter's name was nothing but a pile of confetti on the table. I swept the pieces into my empty coffee mug. Doris walked by with the pot. "Need a refill?" "Yes," I said. "Fill it to the top." She poured the hot coffee over the torn pieces of the invitation. The thick paper soaked up the black liquid, sinking to the bottom. turning into unreadable mush. I paid my tab, left a $10 tip on a $2 coffee, and walked back out into the night. The humidity had broken. A cool breeze was blowing off the interstate. I was exhausted to the marrow of my bones, but my hands had stopped shaking. November arrived with a brutal, biting cold that stripped the trees bare and turned the sky a permanent, bruised gray. I was working a drywall job in a new subdivision on the east side of town. The house was just a skeleton of pine studs and fiberglass insulation. The air inside smelled of joint compound, sawdust, and the metallic tang of cold nails. I wore a heavy canvas jacket, a respirator mask hanging loosely around my neck. I ran a sanding block over a freshly taped seam, my arm moving in a rhythmic sweeping arc. The white dust rained down onto my boots. It was tedious, shoulder-burning work. It required patience. If you rushed it, if you tried to cut corners, the paint would catch the light and reveal every hidden flaw beneath the surface. You couldn't fake a smooth wall. I wiped my brow with the back of a chalky wrist. It had been 4 months since the wedding. I hadn't called Hannah. I hadn't texted. I hadn't driven past her old apartment or checked Evelyn's social media pages to look for wedding photos. I had instituted a policy of total, unconditional surrender. In the early days right after the diner, the silence was agonizing. It felt like holding my breath underwater. Every time my phone buzzed with a spam call or a text from my foreman, a pathetic, delusional spark of hope would ignite in my chest, only to be immediately smothered by reality. But as the weeks bled into months, the silence changed. It stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a boundary I was respecting. Hannah had asked for space, for absence, for peace. Giving her that was the only act of fatherhood I had left to offer. I finished the wall, running my bare hand over the joint. It was perfectly flush, seamless. I packed up my tools, the heavy thunk of the hammers and trowels echoing in the empty, unfinished room. That evening, I drove to a church basement on the south side. The room was aggressively depressing. Fluorescent lights flickered behind yellowed plastic panels. The floor was covered in a thin commercial carpet that had been stained by decades of spilled coffee and wet winter boots. About 20 folding chairs were arranged in a jagged circle. I took a seat near the back. The air smelled of stale donuts and wet wool. The meeting started. People talked. An older guy named Pete talked about losing his pension. A young woman, barely out of her teens, cried about pawning her mother's wedding ring. I listened. I didn't just hear the words. I absorbed the shared frequency of our failures. When the silence stretched, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I'm Thomas," I said. My voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "I'm an alcoholic." "Hi, Thomas," the circle murmured back. "I've got 15 months today." A smattering of polite, genuine applause broke out. I didn't smile. I just looked down at my hands. They were caked with white drywall dust, the skin around the knuckles cracked and bleeding from the dry air. 4 months ago, I crashed my daughter's wedding, I said. It was the first time I had spoken the words out loud in this room. I had been too ashamed before. The room grew very still. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought showing up sober was a gift, but it wasn't. It was an ambush. I rubbed my thumb over a callus on my palm. She kicked me out. She looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing to her, and she was right to do it. I looked up, scanning the faces in the circle. They were looking back at me with a brutal, unflinching understanding. For a long time, my drinking was a way to avoid the consequences of my actions. But I realized recently that my sobriety, I was trying to use that to avoid consequences too. I thought if I put the bottle down, the slate got wiped clean. I thought I didn't have to pay the toll for the 20 years I spent wrecking her life. I paused, letting out a long, slow breath. The knot in my chest, the one that had been pulled tight since July, loosened just a fraction. "I can't fix what I broke," I continued quietly. "I can't build a time machine. I can't go back and be the dad who taught her how to ride a bike, or the dad who walked her down the aisle. That guy is dead. I killed him. All I can do now is stay out of her way. All I can do is build a life where I don't cause any more damage." It's not a victory lap. It's just maintenance. I leaned back in the folding chair. Thanks for letting me share. After the meeting, I stood in the freezing parking lot, zipping my canvas jacket up to my chin. Pete walked past, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. He didn't offer any platitudes. He didn't tell me she would come around eventually. He just nodded and kept walking toward his rusty sedan. It was the most profound comfort I had felt in years. I got into my truck. The interior was freezing. I started the engine, the familiar rattling roar shaking the cab. I let it idle, waiting for the heater to kick in. I reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a padded manila envelope. I had spent the last 2 weeks agonizing over it. I had written and destroyed a dozen letters. Some were angry, some were begging, some were pathetic attempts at explaining the unexplainable nature of addiction. In the end, I threw them all in the trash. Instead, I wrote 3 sentences on a plain piece of lined notebook paper. Hannah, you were right to send me away. I am proud of the woman you became in spite of me. Have a beautiful life. I didn't sign it, Dad. I just signed it, Thomas. Inside the envelope, along with the note, I placed a cashier's check. It wasn't a life-changing amount of money. It was $5,000. It was every dime I had managed to scrape together and save over the last 15 months, working double shifts and living in a studio apartment above a laundromat. It wasn't a down payment on a house, and it certainly didn't cover the cost of a Hawthorne Botanical Gardens wedding. It was just an anonymous contribution to her future, a silent penance. I dropped the envelope off at a blue steel mailbox on the corner of 4th and Elm. I didn't put a return address on it. I just pulled the heavy metal handle, dropped it into the dark chute, and let it go. Hearing the dull thud of the envelope hitting the bottom of the box felt like exhaling a breath I had been holding for 20 years. I climbed back into the F-150. The heater was finally blowing warm, dry air into the cab. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the curb. The streets were quiet, slick with a thin layer of frost that caught the glow of the streetlights. I glanced at the dashboard. The plastic Triceratops sat glued to the cracked vinyl above the radio. I had epoxied it there the morning after the diner. It sat there missing its leg, staring out the windshield, a permanent passenger in my ruined, rattling life. I didn't feel happy. Happiness was a cheap, fleeting emotion sold in commercials. What I felt was something heavier, denser, and far more durable. I felt solid. I was a man who knew exactly what he was, what he had done, and what he had lost. I was a ghost who had finally learned how to stop haunting the people he loved. I drove into the dark, the headlights carving a narrow path through the freezing night. The road ahead was empty. The heater was rattling, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking in the rearview mirror. If Thomas's raw and heartbreaking journey resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder about the harsh, honest realities of redemption and letting go. We bring you deep, grounded stories like this every week, so make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new release. Drop a comment below. Did Thomas do the right thing?